He says Paul wants to probe that idea of hearing. What exactly do they need to hear? What exactly does it mean to hear? Is it a superficial hearing? I love this quotation. I am a deeply superficial person. How are you deep and superficial at the same time? But I suppose that you could be that way. Is it just a superficial hearing? Did they just hear the good news like you hear it in the background? You know, you're driving down the road and you just sort of hear something on the radio, but you're not really paying any attention. Is it a superficial hearing, or did they genuinely understand what they had been presented? Well, Paul says it wasn't superficial at all. They understood that God was coming into this world and was going to offer the gospel to everyone. They understood that God had come into this world through Jesus Christ, and that if they did not accept what God was doing in this world, they would be rejected. It was not a superficial kind of hearing. What they understood is that God could act towards Gentiles like he had acted towards Jews in choosing them, and he could bring judgment on his own people. Moses was the first in a long line of prophets who said this to them. They knew this from the very beginning, that God could reject them and that God wanted to include Gentiles. God had always been saying this, and so God is trustworthy, and we can rely upon him in rebuilding our own lives. Moses said back in Deuteronomy chapter 32 that those who are not a nation would stir up jealousy in Israel. Moses wanted them to know that Gentiles were going to be included so that God could draw the Jews to him. The Jews are God's chosen people, and God wants them to come to know him and to find him. And that's just one of the reasons why Paul says that he's going to raise up this nation to arouse jealousy. Now that's a theme that Paul is going to bring up here in the next couple chapters, that he wants us to make them jealous because we have a relationship with God right now and they don't. And he wants that to arouse jealousy in Israel. In Isaiah 65, again, Moses was the first in a long line of prophets who had this idea. I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. God has been saying from the beginning that he is sovereign, that he can choose who he is going to offer himself to. He can spread the good news around the entire world. He can also reject those who reject him. And whether we are Jews or Gentiles, God can say, if you're not going to be obedient, if you're not going to love me, then I am going to reject you. God can do this. He has the sovereign power. Gentiles who were not seeking righteousness, as it says in verse 9:30, Gentiles who did not ask for God have found him, as it says in 10:20. This is the truth that Isaiah brings out. And then in 10:21, Paul finally turns to this last idea, and that is Israel's failure. They did not turn to him in the numbers that God wanted them to turn. God continues to extend his grace to Israel. He holds his hands out to them. He asks them, he begs them, he implores them to come and find him and to hang on to him as he is reaching out to them. God still cares about the lost people in this world. He still cares about the Jews who are lost in this world, and he reaches out his hand to them. But Israel continues to be stubborn, to be disobedient and obstinate. They continue, for the most part, to reject Jesus Christ as their Messiah. And that is still true today. Now, it's not true of all Jews, and it is also true that Gentiles haven't turned to him. All of us haven't turned and followed Jesus. But God has offered it all to us, and many of us have accepted. Today's passage has a lot to do with missions, with what God wants to do in this world. He wants to send the light out into the entire world. And when you sit down at the tables today for lunch, look at the globe. God wants us to be involved in missions. But this text is not encouraging us to send out missionaries. God wants us to be involved, but this text is not about telling us to send out missionaries. We got the right idea, it might be the wrong text. Now, what it does say is that God has already sent out missionaries. He already sent out Paul. He already sent out the apostles. He already sent out evangelists. He already sent out teachers. He already sent out all of his Christians at that time. He's telling the Roman Christians that God has already sent out missionaries. And to me, what that implies is that God has already sent you. If, as a believer, you are being sent into your mission field. And that whether that mission field is in very strange places like Johnson, or even to the uttermost parts of Beatrice, God has sent you into the world. He has already done this. Even Cooper Nuclear Station. She was going, no. Sure. God has already sent you. This is not about us getting more motivated. This is the fact that God has already sent you to preach the gospel. You already have good news. And specifically, he is reminding us that God has sent evangelists and prophets and apostles to the Jews. And they have rejected. That is specifically what this passage is talking about. He's not telling us that, yes, we need to be involved in this whole process and go. He is saying, he's reminding them that God has already sent apostles to the Jews and they have rejected Jesus. They have failed to believe it. But this text still has important things to tell us about evangelism, and one of them is that we are already been sent. And we need to follow them. Paul is not calling on the church to send out missionaries with the message of the gospel. He assumes that it's being done. God is assuming in this passage, Paul is assuming in this passage, that you are already sharing your faith with other people. That you are already inviting them into a relationship with Jesus Christ. He's not commanding you to do it in this passage. He's assuming that we're doing it. So you've got to ask yourself, this last week, were you an evangelist for the gospel? Actually, were you a good evangelist for the gospel? Did you behave in a loving manner this week? If you did, then you are a good evangelist of the gospel. He assumes that we're doing this job. People can only believe in Jesus when they hear about him. It is not just enough to live a good life and to be loving. We also have to tell people about Jesus Christ. He says faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word of Christ. We have to tell them that Jesus Christ is Lord and that God raised him from the dead. They need to understand that specific part of the message. It's not just that they understand, oh, good people get to go to heaven. Well, some good people go to heaven, some people don't. They need to understand about Jesus. There is a tie between preaching the gospel and being saved that is being severed in our churches today, in the lives of many Christians. I was walking down the street last night, oddly, considering I don't have to walk very far, and I stopped to talk to a woman who was also walking down the street. And she said, she doesn't go to our church, and she said she wanted me to go talk to her mother, who doesn't go to her church or our church. And she said something that didn't belong in any of our churches, and that is, my mother, I'm not quoting, but I'm getting close. She said, my mother is going to go to heaven because she was a good mom. There is a severance between the gospel message and preaching. She had come up with this idea, and I'm sure it's not taught in her church, and I'm sure it's not taught in my church, our church, and I'm sure it's not taught in her mother's church. But she believed this, that her mother gets to go to heaven because she was a good mom. Moms, I really like you, but that's not how you get into heaven. We need to reconnect the gospel message of Jesus Christ with our preaching. A lot of people in this world, like this lady, have caved into the idea that there is no truth and that if we pronounce the truth, that we will come across as being intolerant. We are very afraid of this. But Paul is reminding us that we have to be intolerant. The only way they can get to heaven is through Jesus Christ. The only way that they can be saved is if we preach it. And we have already been sent, and so we are already in position to tell them about Jesus Christ. They need to hear it, and they need to act on it. Some teach